Ancient Egypt, one of the most famous civilizations in history, full of pyramids, pharaohs, and stories almost everyone thinks they already knows. But what if one of the biggest stories is wrong? What if the people doing forced labor in Egypt didn't live the way movies, school books, and legends made you believe? Because when most people hear Egyptian slave, they imagine chains, whips, and thousands of broken men dragging stones for the pyramids. But the real story is stranger, more complicated, and in some ways more unsettling, because Egyptian slavery did exist, just not in the simple form people imagine. Today, we're breaking down what life could actually look like for a slave in ancient Egypt who became one, what they did, how they lived, and whether they could ever get free. And by the end, we'll answer the biggest question of all. Did slaves really build the pyramids, or is that one of history's most famous myths? First, we need to clear something up. Slavery in ancient Egypt was not always one single system. It changed over time. It depended on your status, and it depended on how you entered that life in the first place. Some people were treated as war captives, some entered labor because of debt, and some were pulled into state work through labor conscription. So if you were living in ancient Egypt, your daily life could be harsh in very different ways, depending on which system trapped you. Let's start with the harshest category, people captured in war. These were usually prisoners taken from conquered lands, both soldiers and civilians, then moved into Egyptian service after military campaigns. In the most severe cases, these people could be treated as property of the state or property of powerful elites who received them from the pharaoh. Egyptian rulers left records bragging about bringing captives home in huge numbers, especially after victories in foreign lands. To the pharaoh, these people were proof of power, living symbols that Egypt had conquered another people and turned them into labor. If you were one of these captives, your life would begin with total loss, loss of homeland, family stability, language, and freedom. You could be sent wherever labor was needed, workshops, estates, temples, households, fields, or royal projects. And unlike a free Egyptian worker, you didn't get to choose where you went, or whether you wanted to go at all. For some of these captives, the worst part was not only the work, it was being an outsider in a land that saw itself as the center of civilization. You were foreign, cut off, and easier to control because you had fewer local ties, fewer protections, and almost no power. If your parents were already in that position, your future could begin there too, because in some cases, status could pass through the family. That meant some children entered life already trapped inside a system they never chose. And if you're wondering whether there was any way out, sometimes there was, but it was never simple. One possible path was military service. In some cases, a captive who served loyally and proved useful might improve his standing or even be allowed to return home. But that was not guaranteed. It was a possibility, not a promise. There was another route into slavery too, and this one didn't begin on a battlefield. It began with debt. Imagine you owe money, or you borrowed goods, or you simply fell into hardship and could not repay what you owed. In some periods of ancient Egypt, people could settle that debt by entering bonded service. Sometimes a person sold his own labor for a fixed term, and sometimes, more disturbingly, a family member could be pledged into service instead. That means in ancient Egypt, poverty itself could push people into unfreedom, not because they were conquered, but because they were desperate. And here the story gets uncomfortable in a different way, because for some very poor people, bonded service could actually seem better than starvation. That does not make it freedom, but it does show how harsh ordinary poverty could be. If someone entered bonded labor, there was usually an agreement attached to it, a period of service meant to clear the debt. So, unlike permanent war captivity, bonded labor could, in theory, end once the obligation was fulfilled. But theory and real life are not always the same, especially when the powerful are the ones enforcing the contract. Still, this kind of labor shows us something important. Egyptian slavery was not always industrial, and not always racial in the later modern sense. It was often tied to war, debt, status, and the needs of the state. Now we come to the third category, and this one sits in a gray area. Corvée labor. This was not always slavery in the private ownership sense, but it was still forced labor, ordered by the state. If the pharaoh needed a large project completed, mining, quarrying, transport, construction, irrigation, local officials could call up workers. You might be living a normal peasant life one week, and then be ordered into labor service the next. That's why some historians treat this system differently from slavery, because the workers were not always owned by a private master. But from the workers' point of view, being forced away from home to work for the state did not feel especially free, especially if the work was dangerous, exhausting, or far from your family. And this matters because many giant Egyptian building projects were likely powered not by mass chattel slavery, but by this kind of organized state labor. We'll come back to that in a moment, because it's the key to the pyramid myth. But first, what would daily life actually look like for someone trapped in these systems? For many slaves in Egypt, the most common work was not dragging giant stones across the desert. It was household labor. Serving in elite homes, assisting craftsmen, working as gardeners, weavers, hairdressers, field workers, and domestic servants. That means a slave's life was often much closer to the home and workshop than to the giant monuments people imagine. Some lived inside their master's household, ate from that household's stores, and worked in routines that blended labor with daily domestic life. Others worked in agriculture or craft production, helping sustain the wealth of estates, temples, and officials. And yes, some labor could be brutal, especially in quarries, mines, and large construction environments. Ancient Egypt had no modern safety standards, no protective systems like the ones people expect today. So if you were sent into dangerous work, injury and death were always part of the risk. And that danger did not only fall on slaves. One of the strangest truths about Egypt is that many dangerous jobs were done by both forced laborers and paid workers, so the line between free but poor and unfree and trapped could sometimes blur in daily experience, even if the legal status was very different. Another thing people often miss: Egyptian slavery was not always a rigid caste system the way later racial slavery became in the Atlantic world. Slaves in Egypt could sometimes own personal belongings, some could marry free Egyptians. Some could assimilate into the communities where they lived and worked, and over time, some could move closer to full citizenship, especially in later periods. This does not mean Egyptian slavery was gentle. It means it was different systems, different rules, different paths in, and in some cases, different paths out. For example, a slave might improve status through service in a temple. There was a process sometimes described as becoming purified, moving into religious service and leaving certain forms of forced labor behind. Others could save goods or money, if their situation allowed it, and negotiate their way out of bondage. Rare, yes, but not impossible. Marriage could also change a person's status. So could adoption by a free Egyptian family. In that case, a person could be absorbed into the family and become a full legal member of society. Again, not common enough to romanticize the system, but real enough to show how fluid Egyptian social categories could sometimes be. Most sales and transfers were also not like the theatrical public slave markets many people imagine from later history. Transactions often happened through formal agreements, before officials, with contracts and legal recognition. That made the system bureaucratic, not humane, but bureaucratic. And that tells us something about Egypt. Power there often worked through administration, paperwork, and hierarchy, not only through open violence. But don't misunderstand the picture. If you tried to run, punishment could be severe. If you were forced into labor for the state and fled, your family could suffer the consequences too. If you defied your master, refused work, or challenged authority, you could expect harsh treatment. And if your job involved dangerous extraction or construction, the work itself could break you even without direct punishment. So yes, ancient Egyptian slavery could be brutal. It just wasn't always brutal in the way pop culture simplifies it. Now let's talk about the myth everyone knows, the pyramids. For generations, people have repeated the same image, endless lines of slaves building the Great Pyramids under the whip. The evidence suggests something more rational. The state assembled massive teams, including professionals and temporary laborers, to carry out royal projects. These workers likely served in shifts, they were provisioned, and in Egyptian culture, working on a royal tomb could even carry honor. Workers left graffiti too, playful team names that show pride, humor, and group identity. That is not what you expect from the old image of endless anonymous slaves under pure terror. So where did the pyramid slave myth come from? Part of it comes from ancient writers like Herodotus, who mixed history with stories and was not always reliable. Another part comes from later biblical readings, especially the story of the Exodus, which many people blended with pyramid building even though the timelines do not fit. The pyramids are far older than the period usually associated with the Israelites in historical discussion. So one of history's most famous images, slaves building pyramids, survives not because the evidence is strong, but because the story is powerful. And powerful stories are hard to kill. There's another twist here too, one that connects ancient Egypt to much later slavery. In the modern era, especially in the American South, some defenders of slavery pointed to Egypt as a model civilization. They imagined Egypt as proof that a society could be rich, grand, and slave-based, and still call itself glorious. But that comparison was deeply misleading. Egyptian slavery was not the same as race-based chattel slavery in the Atlantic world. It came out of different ideas, different structures, and different historical conditions. And even the image they borrowed, the giant slave-built monument civilization, was built on a myth. So the misunderstanding of ancient Egypt ended up being used to justify very real horrors thousands of years later. That may be one of the strangest parts of the whole story, a distorted past helping defend a brutal present. So, what was a day in the life of an Egyptian slave really like? It depended. If you were a war captive, it could mean loss, displacement, forced labor, and almost no control over your future. If you were in bonded service, it could mean living under another person's power until debt was cleared, or until the system decided you had paid enough. If you were caught in corvée labor, it could mean state service that looked less like private slavery, but still took your time, your strength, and sometimes your safety. Your work might be domestic, agricultural, religious, artisanal, or dangerous physical labor. Your life might be harsh, temporary, negotiable, or nearly hopeless. You might find a path out, you might not. That's what makes ancient Egypt so difficult to reduce into one clean sentence. It was a civilization full of rank, ritual, bureaucracy, and force, but also one where social boundaries could sometimes shift in ways people do not expect. And that's why the truth is more interesting than the myth. Because the question was never just, were there slaves in ancient Egypt? The real question is, what kind of slavery, under what rules, for how long, and for whom? And once you ask that, the old movie version starts to fall apart. Ancient Egypt was not a simple world of monuments built only by tortured slaves. It was a world of power, labor, hierarchy, and survival, where freedom itself could be fragile. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Because the deeper you look into history, the less it fits the simple stories people love to tell.